Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. If you want to understand the future of food, don't start in a field. Start in a spreadsheet. Or at least you should be able to. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Climate change is reshaping our food system faster than our data infrastructure can keep up. Recent research has said that about 50% of food inflation is now driven by climate disruptions. That means the price of your coffee, your cooking oil, your fruit and vegetables, your bread, half of that volatility is already climate change playing out in real time. And if climate is now the biggest driver of food prices, then forecasting the future of agriculture and commodities isn't just an economic exercise, it's a climate adaptation strategy. Yet the information we rely on to make sense of that volatility, crop reports and prices, forecasts and trade flows, is increasingly politicized, fragmented, or simply unavailable. In other words, we're trying to navigate a storm with the radar turned off. Today on Shaken Not Burned, we're asking what it actually means to build resilience to climate impacts, when the first casualty is often data resilience. And we're being joined by someone who's trying to rebuild that radar from the ground up. Francisco Martin-Rayo is the CEO of Helios AI, a company that's just launched the first multi-agent AI system designed specifically to predict climate and economic-driven food disruptions, and to make that level of foresight accessible to everyone, from small farmers to global retailers. So this isn't a tech hype episode, it's a conversation about what happens when a hotter, more volatile world collides with a food system that's flying blind, and what it would take to give everyone, not just a privileged few, the ability to see the next shock before it hits. So Francisco, before we get into the state of the food system, I'd love to start with your own path. You could be working on any number of different climate or AI challenges. So how did you end up working at the intersection of climate, data, and food systems?
Yeah, it's a really interesting background, I would say. I spent a lot of my time doing digital transformations, running AI businesses at the very beginning of my career, importing avocados from Mexico to the United States. My co-founder, Eden John Lilar, she was a senior AI ML engineer at Google. She'd worked on Palm, which is now Gemini, had won the Abby Award, but had also owned a bunch of restaurants. And so we had these, we like to say unique, some people say weird, backgrounds between food and tech. And one of the things that we saw was happening is the acceleration of climate change. We felt that we are past the point of no return. We have to get used to living in a world that is at least 2 degrees hotter on average. That means some places are going to be much hotter than that. And we felt that it was going to have a huge negative impact in terms of volatility, price increases, disruptions writ large across the global food supply chain. So it was kind of the negative hypothesis for us. But we're technologists, we're entrepreneurs, we're optimists. We felt that technology was advancing at such a pace that we could build an artificial intelligence platform that could help predict all of these disruptions before they happened.
Like, how do you do that? What does it actually mean when we talk about flying blind? When we talk about it in practical terms, what does that actually mean?
I think one of the things that's been most interesting for us is at its core, what Helios does is we predict the price and climate risk of agricultural commodities. 75 of them across 90 countries, 6,000 price series, all that stuff. What's strange about the space, most companies out there that do this work will have a single model, and they use the same model to predict the price of plastic versus pomegranates. And to us, it was, for a long time, you could understand why that made sense, right? Compute was really expensive. You didn't have access to global weather data that could be updated all the time. But the world has totally changed, right? You can have access to global weather data updated every 24 hours. Compute is much cheaper than it's ever been. Your algorithms are much faster. And so people are continuing to fly blind, but now it's more of a choice rather than a restriction that just exists in their life. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense, but this leads me to this whole question about whether or not people are really aware of the potential of what's out there and how that potential can be used to actually address some of the challenges we face. Because one of the things that I question, we talk about the idea that, climate risk has accelerated so rapidly that the main thing we're facing is uncertainty about what's going to happen next. But we talk about it outpacing data infrastructure. Is it outpacing data infrastructure, or is it outpacing the way people are looking at data and what they can do with it?
I think it's most definitely the second. I think the beauty of the space that we're in is that you haven't historically really had that high of a level of granular information, real time, et cetera, et cetera. And so it isn't like you have petabytes of data that people have been using and now they're saying, well, there's 2 or 3 times as much. Really, for the first time in this industry, you have access to this enormous amount of real-time data. But exactly to your second point, we don't really have the tools. I mean, they exist, but they're not really at large, if you will, right? People aren't using them at scale to be able to analyze data. And so whether you're a farmer or you're a big buyer, you can have more minute, up-to-date information about your farm than ever before. If you're a government, you can have better information about all of the farmland in your country and what the food security context is likely to be than ever before. But do you have the ability to surface what really matters? As soon as you have more and more and more data, often you end up with more and more noise, and you really need artificial intelligence to help you identify the signal from the noise.
Do you understand what level of granularity should you have? And because you're doing forward projections, should it be the 2.5 or the 4 degree or the 6 degree or the 8 degree? I think it's very confusing for a lot of people. When you're looking at how to identify the signals, where do you think the most fragile or the most failure-prone data elements are in the food system?
From a data perspective, what's really interesting about food is it's typically grown in more of the rural areas, right? Not urban areas, which is typically where you have the greatest paucity of data infrastructure. And so you're starting from a little bit behind in terms of having availability and access to that data. And then that's probably where you're most vulnerable. One of the things I think that's really important as we think of the vulnerability as well is, can you get consistent data longer term? Can you start to make those investments longer term again so that you're able to look at not just what's happened in the past and predict, but be able to test those predictions month by month, year by year in real time. And that's across climate, right? It's not just what's the temperature, but what are the water levels, what's the precipitation patterns, et cetera, et cetera. It really is a multifaceted problem.
So that raises 2 questions for me. How do you go about actually addressing the problem of the paucity of data in the places that you really need it? And then, of course, the big question, what do we do when a lot of the historical repositories of data are no longer available? For example, when the USDA data shutdown happened, what does that tell us about the problems, the design flaws that we're trying to manage?
Well, I think I'll give you one positive example, more concerning example. The positive example is there are more satellites around us than ever before. It is cheaper to operate them, cheaper to launch them. We have more climate data today than at any other point in human history. And it is cheaper, basically free, to be able to ingest all that data, put it through new algorithms. You pay basically nothing for compute and start to do really interesting analysis off of it. And so we're finally able to get really good data in real time for highly rural areas, basically all over the world, which is just so wonderful and such a unique point in human history. That's the positive part. When you look at the government shutdown and the way it impacted reports coming out of the USDA, one of the things that was so interesting is how dependent your global food flows are on the reporting being done by the USDA. The USDA, and we're in this space, does something that no other agricultural service in the world does in terms of the quality, detail, and regularity of their reports at a global scale. And so they really do move markets. When it wasn't available, there were no private sector options that were able to fill that gap. And so for us, it really underscored the need to make sure we continue to invest in these public institutions so that you can have access to that data continuously and make better decisions.
Well, I think there's something really interesting you're surfacing there, which is the fact that a number of our systems are very, very reliant on traditional sources of data that have been around for a really long time, and everyone expects them to be there. And often people who are operating within a system don't really think about what might be needed because they're within the system and they just assume it's always going to be there. So for me, this really brings up two issues, one of which is it's actually not even certain we're going to be able to rely on the sorts of data that we used to rely on historically because it's such a complicated area, and how important it is that we actually have people who aren't operating within that system full time to come in and go, hang on, can't we just do this differently and find new ways of getting the data we need? I mean, you mentioned that we can get the data through satellites. How granular and accurate is that? What's the sort of thing it can tell us?
It can be extremely granular. I mean, the only caveat now is you could go down to a 30 square centimeter piece of visual imagery, if you will, from a satellite that could tell you, is there leaf rust on your coffee crop? How tall are the wheat fields? How is corn doing? How is cocoa doing? How many pods are there? That's still really expensive. Basic climate data down to the 1 kilometer radius, basically free. And what's also really cool is the best, weather forecasting models are now open source. And so it used to be for the last 10 years that you would have to pay a fair amount of money to have really good forecasting. But a lot of the investments that Google has made, as an example, they make their GraphCast available for free. That's the best weather forecasting model for a 16-day period in the market, bar none. And that'll only continue to accelerate.
What sort of data is going to move markets? Because you talked about leaf rust on a plant. And surely one of the challenges, we know extreme weather is a problem, and it's fantastic that GraphCast actually provides access to reliable weather data. But it's what's happening on the ground, surely, that is the thing that shocks people. It's when an infection takes root, or because it isn't as simple as just extreme weather. It's also the things that come with extreme weather, which is difference in insect life cycles and weather affecting growth patterns, that kind of thing.
1,000%. One of the most heartbreaking examples we know in our space is, the state of Florida in the United States is most famous for oranges. They used to do 200 million boxes a year. That's down 95%.
I had no idea.
It's crazy, right? And so Florida's natural. If you're buying Florida's natural, you're basically buying Brazilian orange juice, not American orange juice. Felicia, it was a combination of greening, which is one of the new pests that's coming through, and you would have earlier springs because, the world is getting warmer, but they were too early. So the trees would get all excited, they'd start flowering, and then you'd get hit with a frost and all the flowers would fall off and then you wouldn't get any fruit. And that's basically decimated the citrus industry in Florida. And we're going to see that happen globally, basically for a lot of the commodities that we depend on. And so one of the things that we push for really hard is we have to think more thoughtfully, more consciously about adaptability. If we can predict out better than ever before what the weather is going to be like over the next 10, 15 years, and we know what that means for individual crops, that probably means you have to do some crop rotation. Maybe you're not growing oranges anymore in Florida, you're growing pomegranates. Italy is now, it's not huge, but it's growing a nice little mango producing business, which you don't typically associate with Italy. But the weather has gotten so much warmer that it's actually more akin to India in some cases than it was the old Mediterranean.
Well, they do say that Europe is the continent that is warming the fastest. So that's slightly disturbing. One of the things that I always take really personally is coffee and chocolate. What's the future of coffee and chocolate looking like?
Oh, it's so hard because both cocoa and coffee are both perennial crops. And so you have to make investments 5 years before you expect to harvest. We work with one of the largest coffee growers in Brazil. Over the last 5 years, they planted, I think, 5 and 10,000 hectares twice. And both times within the first 3 years, the small trees have been killed off by unexpected frosts. And what they've gone back to the bank and said, hey, we don't think we should keep planting coffee trees. And maybe we should look at planting something else. And what the bank has said is, we will only loan you money to plant coffee trees, nothing else.
And why is that? Because they know them as a coffee grower?
Yeah, because that's what you've typically been growing in that area, because you know them as a coffee grower, because your risk profile right? And your financial analysis is tied to coffee prices, not necessarily to something else.
Okay, well, that's really worrying, because if your ability to operate your farm or whatever it is that you're growing is tied to the commodity price of a commodity that you can no longer grow, then you're not only going to have a problem with that commodity supply, but you're also going to have a massive economic problem on the ground.
Absolutely. And this is where government plays a unique role in our view, right? You have to support these farmers through the transition, through adaptation. Maybe you're not going to be able to grow grasslands in Ireland anymore because it's too dry. Maybe you're not going to be able to grow tomatoes in Spain because it's too dry. Well, what can you grow in this new climate? And that the answer, well known, right? We can do that today in a way we weren't able to even 5 years ago, but there isn't necessarily that infrastructure to help with the transition.
Right. And what do you mean by the infrastructure? Because do you mean policy? Do you mean supply chains? Do you mean bank recognition of shifting risk profiles?
Oh, all of it. A good example is let's assume you're a global brewer, and you have been sourcing over the last 30 to 40 years from particular, your barley and your rye from particular areas. And it turns out you're not going to be able to source your barley and rye 10 years from now from these same areas. But you've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in CapEx into processing facilities, logistics facilities, manufacturing facilities, et cetera. You have to now go identify where you are going to be able to grow barley and rye sustainably over the longer term. And then you have to rebuild that infrastructure, manufacturing, processing, logistics, et cetera. Then you have to build in the financial infrastructure to support that as well. And then you have to build in the know-how for the farmer communities that aren't used to growing this new crop. And so all of the ecosystem isn't there right now.
But then how are we supposed to be able to build new ecosystems if we don't have available data that's historic and current and forecast?
I think the data is available. It's just not available at scale.
Okay.
And it's one of the reasons, to your earlier question, we try to make our product free in many cases for obviously smallholder farms, and are very, very cheap for some of the smaller buyers. And that's on purpose, because one of the beauties and the promise of artificial intelligence is that you can democratize these insights globally. It is quite remarkable to think that the backbone of the generative AI that a Nestle is using is the same backbone that rural farmer in Cameroon is using, assuming they're using ChatGPT.
But one of the things that is confusing to the non-AI expert is this differentiation between generative AI and chat and video and industrial AI, where we actually get the optimization of data so it can help people. How do we tell the difference?
Best way to think about it, we think, is it's the difference between horizontal versus vertical AI. The horizontal AI are your generalist models like a ChatGPT that you can ask, hey, can you summarize this for me? Can you write a letter? Can you write an email, et cetera, et cetera? But vertical AI are the places where you need a much higher degree of nuance. You need to understand the workflows. You need to upload proprietary data. So a good example would be agriculture. If you just got ChatGPT as a large language model, ingested a bunch of irrigation information and temperature information and pesticide information about your farm, it probably would muck it up, and it would just give you a bunch of bad insights. But a vertical model that is trained specifically on agricultural crops and has that history is going to be able to give you significantly better insights. That, to us, is where the future is really exciting, where you have those kind of vertical AI companies that are building with experts who are in the field on highly nuanced topics. You're really starting to see huge ROI on that.
So that really is about taking all of the knowledge and experience that's been built up over time and giving access to people who, under normal circumstances, would never have access to it. And that in itself, I suppose, is a form of adaptation, because everybody has to work together to try and actually shift the way in which we grow and where we grow food.
Absolutely, yeah.
I did want to ask you about this, because you said That it's free for some smallholder farmers and cheap for. What's your percentage? I'm just interested in how many big companies have you got? How many smallholders? Where do you operate?
Most of our customers are very large procurement companies, $1 billion plus, that are buying and selling agricultural commodities globally.
So they're doing it because they need, for example, to supply, 40,000 supermarkets with the same, I'm going back to coffee, same pots of coffee. Okay.
Yeah, the same coffee, the same mangoes, the same tomatoes, the same blackberries, raspberries.
So they need to be able to plan far enough in advance that they've got their systems, they get their product, it goes through their processing, they sell it to whoever, and everybody makes loads of money and they're all very happy.
Well, and it used to be that you only cared about price. And so you were trying to optimize for that. But because of the acceleration of climate change, you are starting to see very senior, top of the food chain buyers, pun intended, that are not always getting the crops that they need either for their products or to put on the shelves. And that is your biggest nightmare, right? If you are, let's say Tesco, right, one of the most important retailers in the UK, you want to make sure you have tomatoes year round. If you don't have tomatoes, then you're not making any money off of it. That is your biggest fear. And that's happening more and more and more and more.
And there's something that goes along with that, because I think during COVID, we all got a lesson in how things don't necessarily end up on shelves when you expect them. But people were prepared to accept that because it was COVID, there was a pandemic, people were doing the best that they could. There seems to be this weird thing around climate change where some people kind of accept it, know it's happening, and are reacting to it. And everyone else is sort of sitting around going, Tesco hasn't got my tomatoes, I'm going to go to Aldi or something like that. So you run the risk not just of not having the product to go on the shelf, but actually losing your customer base.
Absolutely. And in fairness to the consumer, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, almonds are one of the things we talk about a lot. Almonds are one of the thirstiest crops in the world that are in the United States, primarily grown in California, which has a water shortage. And for the majority of the time, we were exporting the vast majority of almonds to China. And what it really means is you're taking really scarce resource, water, in a state that really needs it to grow everything else that we eat, and shipping it over to China, which is one of your strategic competitors.
That doesn't sound like a good plan.
No, it doesn't. But everybody says, well, almond milk is better for you than real milk. And so it is really difficult to find the balance. We spend a lot of time on farms, and it is heartbreaking just to see the amount of waste, because consumers will only buy the iceberg lettuce or the romaine
the
lettuce.
perfect one.
That is perfect. And so you've got 30, 50, 60% waste sometimes.
That's insane, given the fact that there are people who are going hungry.
Yeah, but we can make a difference, right? When you go to the supermarket, buy the slightly uglier tomato.
Yeah, the wonky ones.
More wilted lettuce, the wonky ones. Because then they won't throw it away. And then they won't keep telling the growers that they only will take the perfect carrot, right? Give me the ugly knobby carrot that's a little moldy. That's okay.
But so why? So the thing that doesn't really make sense to me, well, I suppose on one level it does make sense to me because obviously everybody's trying to make a buck. But if you are an almond grower in California and you are using up water that could be used for something else and selling overseas, how does that make sense for the California economy?
Probably not for the California economy, right? And you're subsidizing a lot of the water. But for the individual farmer, it makes sense.
Right.
Farming is, I think, the hardest business out there because it is so low margin and everything has to be perfect, right? And if everything is too perfect, then everybody has a really good crop and then your prices are garbage and you probably lose money. And if you have a really bad harvest, then you don't have anything to sell and you lose money. And so you need it to be kind of, either everybody else has a bad harvest and you have a really good one, or you have a just good enough harvest. But the amount of variables that have to be right for people to make money I find it incredibly stressful. It's a very difficult business to run.
So that brings me back to what I said in the intro about the idea that up to 50% of inflation is being driven by climate volatility when it comes to food prices. So what type of climate events are showing up in the data in the biggest way? And are there things that don't show up, like pests or, obviously, I'm not an agricultural person, so I don't know. But can you talk to me about what kind of signals break first?
Yeah, I'll tell you one that you expect and one that will be a surprise.
Oh, I like that.
Everybody knows the world is getting warmer on average. And so for perennials like mangoes in Peru or oranges in Brazil, you need a certain number of what's called chill hours, which basically says it's got to be relatively cold for a relatively long period of time so that these trees can relax, basically feel a little bit of stress. Then it gets warm and they come back alive and they have all the flowers and all that stuff. Both in Peru for mangoes and then citrus in Brazil, the winters have been too warm. And so you're not getting the sufficiently long number of chill hours or cold time. And so you're basically having these horrible harvests that are down 70% from the record high. It just wipes it out. And so we expect that to happen more and more and more. For anything that's perennial, that requires kind of a certain amount of cold during the winter, that's just going to get harder to source.
But so that is not a climate shock. That's just a sweeping change in weather patterns. And I think from the conversations I've had, most people seem to be thinking about physical climate risk in terms of the shocks, the floods, the wildfires. But what you're talking about really, if you're talking about shifts in basic seasons, is we're going to have to completely redesign the way in which we do source our food.
Absolutely, 1,000%.
And that's quite a scary point. Sorry, I interrupted you because you were about to give me the second example that was less easy to understand.
But it's a really important interruption because it requires a complete rethinking of what we grow and where we grow it. Knowing that it's going to take you a few years to make those changes and invest in those new perennial trees and new crops that you start harvesting them 3 to 5 years down the line.
Mm-hmm.
The unexpected one are erratic precipitation patterns. And so if on average you're getting 30 centimeters of rain in 30 days, now you're getting still 30 centimeters, but you're probably getting 15 centimeters, 2 days in a row, and then nothing for the next 28 days.
Okay, I can see how that would be a problem.
And it's interesting because people in the industry talk about it all the time. Outside of the industry, people don't realize what a huge problem it is. The scientific explanation behind it is as the temperature gets warmer, the atmosphere is able to hold more and more water, and then eventually it breaks. And so this is what's giving you kind of, an enormous amount of rain, 30 or 45 days of rain in 2 or 3 days, and then no rain going forward. And that's really damaging for all types of crops.
Well, I'm thinking because that is something that has been discussed when it comes to urban flooding, because we've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years. And it makes me think about things like the capacity of the soil to hold water. Yeah, it sounds pretty awful. But then, So what is it about your approach, this idea of a multi-agent AI system, that is actually going to help people identify things that human analysts maybe wouldn't be able to?
Think of it like a team. And so the cool part of a multi-agent model is, we've built one model or one agent, right, that is responsible for climate risk data, one agent that's responsible for prices, one agent that goes out and scrapes 250,000 news sources, et cetera, et cetera. So you end up with a team of, 10 to 15 different agents. And then you have what we call their boss or their manager. And so you would ask a question like, hey, I'm a large farmer in the UK. Should I plant more potatoes or more onions this year? And the manager will think through the question and say, well, we want to look at what the future price is going to be. We want to look at what the climate risk is going to be. And we want to look at some of the news in terms of what the likely demand is going to be for onions versus potatoes. And it would task these 3 agents underneath it to come up, work together and then come up with the right answer. The beauty of a multi-agent model instead of a large language model is all of it is sourced because you require your agents to only look at particular data sets and not go out and invent stuff.
So that then brings me back to this issue about when data sets are shut down by governments. Because obviously, if you're relying on these data sets, that's not going to work either if they're not available. So are we looking at a future where we're going to see more privately sourced data? And how do we know that it's the right data done by the right people with the right knowledge in the right way?
My hopeful hypothesis, I would say, is that you don't really know what you have until it's not there anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think for a long time, we've taken a lot of these reports for granted. Access to this really important information that's coming out from all of these government agencies on a regular basis. As it becomes less available, you will see more of a pull from a lot of these sources to reinstate that.
Right.
We're a private sector company. There are certain levels of reporting. There's certain levels of aggregation. There's anonymity that only the government can do. And you are in this unique time where the government can do more than ever before with the new tools that are available to everybody else. And so you could see yourself in a really good place where the government actually starts to put out more reports that are more granular in nature, even with the same number of people, because they're using these tools.
Okay. Well, then another thing that I suppose comes along with this idea of more data, more granular data, is forecasting and forecasting models, because they can fail. And if you have more climate volatility, there will be more confusion in the data. So how do you avoid building a forecasting model that's just going to fail faster?
It's a really good question. You have to make sure that you're not fitting the data too much toward historical data. And you have to basically think of it as a cone of uncertainty. You have to make sure you're widening that cone large enough to take into account increasing variability. And then you have to look at new inputs. So one of the things that we do is we took the world, we divided it into 14 million hexagons, and then each of those hexagons we characterized from 1 out of 81 climatic archetypes, right? These climatic archetypes are based on temperature, precipitation, soil type, blah, 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 blah. One of the things we use that for is once you characterize that, you can compare the hexagons to each other to understand how anomalous is the weather that's happening and whether some of these hexagons are changing characteristics and becoming another type of hexagon.
And that's because you're tracking them over time consistently.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's something that would have been impossible to do even 3 or 4 years ago. It would have been too expensive. The compute wouldn't have really been there, and probably the data wouldn't have really been there.
Okay. Then what then becomes the most important thing is knowing that the data is accurate. So that's verification and transparency and understanding where that verification comes from. How does that look in your system? And I guess there's a bigger question that comes with that is, what does trustworthy AI look like, especially in a food security context? Because you've got these big companies that operate all over the world. You've got different governments and responsibilities. You've got tiny farms, big farms. It seems very complicated.
Yeah, it really is. And you have to have what we call explainable AI. You always have to be transparent about what is the reasoning behind the insights that you're putting out there. What is the data that you're sourcing? What is the information that you're using and where it's coming from to help inform whatever recommendations or insights you're giving? I think and you've seen that with even something as general as ChatGPT, right? I think that no one is going to trust the black box. And one of the things that's so difficult is today more than ever, there isn't really a single source of truth, right? I mean, I'm sure if we Googled or ChatGPT'd, how much did the temperature rise in 2024?
You get a lot of different answers.
You're going to get a lot of different answers. And I think that's one of the places where you do need greater transparency and greater collaboration across some of these nonpartisan bodies, if those still exist, to be able to provide that information so at least people can have the debate on a single set of facts. That's what we worry about.
Well, I suppose what that's really saying is that for AI to really to fulfill its potential, you actually need a completely different kind of understanding of information integrity, a different kind of understanding of media literacy and sourcing and all these really old-fashioned things for journalists. But they do seem to be a rather fundamental underpinning for useful.
Right. And it's not that you're making your algorithms public, but you have to be able to trust the data.
Yeah. And I think that's a bit of a challenge these days.
Yeah,
I mean, we've talked about the number of, well, actually, I never did get a number of smallholders from you. The proportion, but I'm just thinking, I'm interested in the history of access, because we talk about smallholder farmers, we talk about incredibly thin margins, talk about people who are at the mercy of a changing climate and a globalized commodity supply chain, but they've never really had access to these forecasts at all. So who did have them, and how is that all changing now? And is that changing everywhere or just in certain places?
My hope is it's changing everywhere. Historically, it was the ABCDs who had access to the best data generally, right? The Archer Daniels, Midland, and Bunge, and Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, right? They control 80% of the commodity trade, if you will, in agriculture. What's exciting about where we are is I remember in the 90s, people used to say, well, Africa's never going to catch up because it's going to take $32 trillion to put in landlines for all of them to have television, or not television, but telephones. And then the cell phones came on board. And now they're more connected. India is the most connected country in the world or something. I think the same thing will happen with artificial intelligence. As your compute costs continue to go down, you have these really powerful models that are now, 6 months behind, 9 months behind, but are still better than anything that's ever existed 12 months ago. And those are basically free. And you can put those on everybody's personal device. And suddenly you do have access to this level of data that you didn't have before. I mean, even our platform, you can ask the questions in any language in the world, and it will talk to you in Ukrainian and Japanese and Spanish and French and Cambodian and all that. That's the level of work that would have been required to develop a piece of software like that. Now you build it and it automatically does it. Think of how wonderful that is, right? It's really democratizing access.
What's exciting about that to me is, in fact, weirdly, it's a financial thing. But again, during COVID, I remember farming suddenly became this really exciting thing to a lot of investors because they suddenly recognized that this whole just-in-time model we had to optimize for price and delivery wasn't going to be resilient to shocks. And nobody expects a pandemic. But actually, if we can give this access to smallholder farmers, really what you're talking about is building resilience into the food system at the most granular level.
Absolutely. And making it more profitable for farmers to continue to operate.
Which I think is incredibly important.
It's the only way to be sustainable.
There's an interesting thing here, though, between the giants and the smallholder farmers. If I remember correctly, it's a $299 a month subscription. How do you think that changes the power dynamics of the food system we've got?
I mean, we think it's transformational because you finally have access to the same level of technology that an ABCD will have in the hands of the smallest farmer or the smallest procurement manager, or the smallest grower. And that to us is what will make all the difference in the world, because AI is wonderfully democratic in that sense.
Again, it is this thing of what does it mean in real terms? So if everyone in the supply chain had access to accurate real-time predictions and forecasting, what do you think would change first? Would it be procurement and the methods? Would it be pricing, crop decisions, because we've talked about the need for that, or something as seemingly simple but honestly hideously complicated as contract structures?
I think it would probably be crop decisions first, followed by the timing of sales.
Okay.
So, look at Cote d'Ivoire right now. Part of the reason that we're having a cocoa shortage is because a lot of the farmers just had to sell it into some general collective, had no real information about it. That's no longer the case, right? You can give them full access to not just what is the current cocoa price, but where do we think it's going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? How much of your harvest do you think you should sell early? How much of it should you hold on to? What should you actually be planting? That's information that was really unavailable. I mean, we're working with a Honduran collective and a Rwandan collective. And what we do is for free, right? We make the information available to these coffee growers in both cases for free. And then they disseminate to their smallholder farmers. And then it gives them the ability to make better decisions about what to plant, when to plant, and when to sell. And think of it as the marginal change in access to information.
Yeah.
So your ABCDs are still getting 20% better information than they have historically. But your smallholder farms are going from basically, quarterly reports in the newspaper to daily information about prices. I mean, that is 100x better.
Yeah, and it does change the power dynamics because it means the middlemen can't just say, well, you take this or you don't, and you lose your crop.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
It's going to be a fascinating thing to look at how our concept of food security actually extends, given a greater ability to understand what's going to grow and where it's going to grow best. One of the questions I did want to ask you is, what should we be worried about? Is there something that keeps you up at night about the use of AI in food systems? And that could be anything from misuse to misinformation to overconfidence or even a distortion of the markets.
I think we have such little information, and it's we mean this in a good way, such a legacy industry that they can only benefit from more information, right? It is unique in that sense where people are true experts at what they do, but technology hasn't really touched a lot of these places, especially around forecasting either climate or prices or disruptions or all that. What I worry about, I think, is a lot of the conversation you see in the public discourse is around more floods and, can we build certain things? Major cities going to be underwater, et cetera. And not, are we going to be able to feed ourselves?
Which does seem like quite a critical question.
It was a big one. And it requires so many different types of players to come together. And we could start doing different pilots, right? In Florida, right now, the state government pays citrus farmers who can no longer grow citrus, pays them not to sell their land to real estate developers, which is an insane waste of taxpayer money.
Yeah.
To me, a much more intelligent thing to do would be like, well, you can't grow citrus anymore, but you can grow pomegranates or passion fruit or something. Let's try that out. Let's create that ecosystem for you to actually have a sustainable crop.
And I mean, I suppose one of the things AI could be good at is making those connections, because I always used to think that the construction industry was the most fragmented, connected, giants here and the one-man band here. Agriculture is exactly the same.
Absolutely.
So I suppose then the big question becomes, what kind of governance do we need to make sure that the way that we use AI actually strengthens market integrity and does sensible things like, instead of funneling money to stop farmers selling to developers, enables them to grow a different crop so they can still be farmers?
One of the things that's hardest about this is the technology is changing so rapidly that it's really hard to think of the right governance framework that would continue to accelerate innovation in the right way. I mean, multi-agent models didn't really exist 12 months ago. 36 months ago, no one had really heard about large language models.
Yeah.
24 months ago, right? There's Jan LeCun started a new company that's doing this, right? And he's saying, hey, we're only focused on large language models, and that's not how we're going to get to super intelligence. We have to look at it a totally different way and look at visual and blah, blah, blah. Maybe that'll hit in 12 or 24 months, right? And so I think we're in a period of, we don't know, and we're in a period of such transformative, rapid change that it's difficult to say, hey, here's how we should try and guardrail this.
I get that, but I also think it is a challenge when you're seeing how much disruption is being caused. And human beings don't think that fast. We don't like change unless it makes our lives a lot easier and saves a bit of time. So actually, sometimes we're very good at change. But the point being that it's a complicated area where there does seem to be this battle between who has access, who doesn't have access, who has control over the data. You keep hearing stories about different AI models, or not necessarily models, but there are tools and extensions that change their privacy policies and suddenly start taking data. And that is obviously something that I've seen much more discussed in terms of generative AI. But are you concerned about anything like that in this, as you call it, the vertical AI market?
Yeah, it's so one of the things that's really interesting is the vibe coding space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, you have Lovable, Replit, where it's pretty remarkable, right? You can just put in using natural language, I want you to create X or Y, blah, 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 and it builds the code. But sometimes it will change some of the parameters. And so it will start deleting data or sharing data and all of that. And so it's not at an enterprise level yet. So one of the things to look out for is make sure that whatever application you're using has a certain level of security, if you will, or thoroughness.
Or maybe even clarity about parameters.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's something that we'll see more and more, right? As you're able to offload more of your coding and more of your thinking to artificial intelligence. Those are some of the guardrails I think that we have to be really careful with, which is,
right.
I think, protecting your data, protecting your healthcare data, protecting your proprietary data, and making sure that it's not actually using your IP and sending it out into the ether.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we talk a lot at Shaken Not Burned about misinformation and about the damage it can do. Do you see a risk of data pollution in the food system? Is that something you're concerned about, or is that something AI could actually help detect or filter?
Not really in the food system. We've seen a lot of misinformation, I think, in the climate world, and I think we've lost that battle. It is pretty remarkable, right? I think in the 1970s, when we first started thinking about this, there was general consensus. Everybody kind of agreed on the information. Everybody knew what had to be done, and we are so far from that today. In the 1970s, it was really interesting. There was a general consensus on what the problem was, greenhouse gases. Even Exxon was part of the working group, and people generally understood what had to be done. And then we kind of lost momentum. And if you compare where we are today in 2025 versus where we were in 1970, we are so much further away than we are. And there is so much disinformation and misinformation around this conversation that I don't think it's anything specific to agriculture. I think agriculture can only benefit from AI, but I think the climate conversation has been lost. And the only way to regain it and we're starting to see this now, is you'll just start to feel the impact much more of this accelerating change everywhere, right? In your food system and where you live, where you can get insurance, where you can travel.
But I think on a more positive note, it is good to know that one of the things AI can do is actually help us manage and understand the implications of climate impact on growing potential and possibilities and the places we can actually move things to if we need to. Because let's face it, we're going to need to. It doesn't seem to matter where you are in the world. There's a story in every market of an unexplained pest or a flood or a frost or a change in rain patterns. And I think what you're actually doing is incredibly exciting, because if we are able to democratize access to information and the ability to make decisions based on market information, we're actually getting closer to having a market than we probably ever have had historically. Because one of the things about a market is it's supposed to be a free exchange of information so you can make the right decisions. So perhaps that's
Absolutely
something that we can look forward to. Now, is there anything I haven't asked you about that I should have done for our readers to understand the implications of what you do?
No, I really enjoyed the conversation and the questions. Thank you so much.
Well, in that case, I will say thank you so much for joining us, Francisco. I've really been interested listening to what you've got to say, and I actually realise I have a lot more questions. I need to go away and do some AI research, hopefully without the aid of an AI. But we'll see how that goes. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed learning more about what Helios does. I don't know whether enjoyed is the right word, but found useful learning a little bit more about how much the agriculture sector is going to change and the role of AI in making that a positive one.